Welcome to the debate, Hack Your Habits, using code to rewrite your daily life. Today, we analyze the ideas from the book, The Algorithm of Life. And, imagine standing in the cereal aisle of a grocery store, staring at like 45 different boxes of sugar and grain, and feeling your heart rate literally rise because you just cannot decide.
Oh, absolutely. Or think about scrolling through a streaming app for so long that you eventually just turn off the TV. You just go to sleep without watching anything at all.
Yes, exactly. We have all been there. So today we're looking squarely at one of the most pervasive challenges of the modern era, which is the absolute paralysis of choice.
It really is the defining cognitive burden of our time. I mean, we have infinite options, but highly finite cognitive bandwidth.
Right.
And it creates this daily environment where just navigating your morning routine or, deciding what to prioritize at work, it drains your mental battery before you've even started producing anything of value.
Precisely. And that is why today we are taking the methods introduced in this material using computational thinking and mental algorithms to optimize our decisions and habits. We're examining them not as abstract literary concepts, but as live actionable strategies for living.
Right, practical proposals.
Exactly. I approach this from the position that applying structured algorithmic thinking to our daily routines provides a necessary architecture for automatic success, and it fundamentally frees up our cognitive load for the things that truly matter.
And I come at it from a slightly different way. I strongly question the realism and really the long-term viability of treating human existence like software. I think we have to ask if optimizing every single choice strips away the vital, messy spontaneity of life.
I see.
Yeah, I mean, are we solving a problem or are we just creating a very efficient, joyless machine?
That is the core tension, right? But to understand why this computational approach is so necessary, we first have to look at the core problem with our default human operating system. It's what behavioral psychologists call System 1 thinking.
Right, the fast thinking.
Yes, System 1 is our fast, intuitive, heuristic-driven gut feeling. It feels totally natural, but it is deeply flawed. I mean, think about the anchoring effect,
Oh, sure.
where we let an initial piece of totally irrelevant information dictate a major financial negotiation. Or the optimism bias.
Right, where we assume a new business venture can't possibly fail.
Exactly. So we ignore basic risk assessment. Relying purely on System 1 leads to regret because it prioritizes speed over accuracy. Algorithmic thinking, System 2, isn't about being cold or robotic.
But it kind of sounds robotic, doesn't it?
It sounds that way, but it's an incredibly empowering, deliberate process. It transforms chaotic guesswork into a clear, values-driven strategy.
Look, I completely acknowledge that cognitive biases are very real. System 1 absolutely has its flaws. But I'm sorry, I just don't buy that the solution is to constantly override our intuition.
Why not?
Well, is this actually realistic? That is the foundational question we have to ask here. Human beings did not evolve to operate in a permanent System 2 state of slow, highly effortful deliberation.
No, of course not.
It is cognitively exhausting. If we treat our minds like a flawed piece of software that must be constantly monitored and debugged, we risk severe analysis paralysis. I mean, intuition isn't just some sloppy shortcut. It is the culmination of our subconscious pattern recognition.
I see why you think that. And I completely agree that living permanently in System 2 would be exhausting. Nobody wants that. But let me give you a different perspective. We aren't talking about using complex algorithms for every microscopic choice.
Like what, socks to wear?
Exactly. We're talking about applying it to the structural decisions that govern our lives. So let's look at the actual calculus of choice. How do you make a concrete decision when faced with seemingly endless options?
Okay.
The strategy here is a concept from computational theory known as optimal stopping, specifically the 37% rule.
Right, the mathematical approach to ending a search.
Exactly. It's a real-world application for major life choices, finding an apartment, hiring an employee, or, even choosing a life partner. And the logic is actually quite elegant.
Go on.
When you have a finite window of time or a finite number of options, you spend the first 37% of your search purely exploring. You do not commit to anything.
Wait, completely exploring? You're saying if I see the absolute dream apartment on day 2, I have to just walk away from it?
Mathematically, yes.
Wow.
And here is the why behind it. The number 37% isn't arbitrary. It's derived from the mathematical constant E. It is the exact mathematical tipping point where the risk of passing up the absolute best option perfectly crosses the risk of running out of options entirely.
Okay, so map that out for me.
Sure. Let's say you give yourself 30 days to find an apartment in a competitive city. 37% of 30 days is roughly 11 days.
Right.
For the first 11 days, you look at apartments just to establish a baseline of the market. You rent nothing. But on day 12, you switch from exploration to exploitation. You immediately pull the trigger on the very next apartment you tour that beats the baseline you just established.
And that's it?
That's it. This mathematically maximizes your probability of finding the best possible option, and it kills decision fatigue because you are following a proven threshold.
Okay, that looks brilliant on a whiteboard, but have you considered what happens when we map this onto the chaos of the real world?
What do you mean?
Well, what are the risks here? The mathematics of the 37% rule require a closed, stable system. Life is neither of those things.
Fair.
Let's stick with your apartment hunt example. You spend your 11 days exploring to establish a baseline. But the housing market fluctuates dynamically.
True.
Interest rates shift, new zoning laws pass, seasonal inventories change over a weekend. Applying rigid mathematical exploitation after a purely exploratory phase assumes the variables remain completely static.
Well,
And furthermore, it completely ignores the emotional and contextual nuances of a choice. What if the apartment that mathematically beats your baseline happens to be next to a noisy construction site that wasn't there during your baseline phase?
that's a really fair point, and the construction site is a great, real-world wrinkle. But I would frame it differently. The 37% rule isn't oblivious to dynamic variables. It's a heuristic designed specifically to manage uncertainty when you cannot know all the variables.
But it misses the context.
The construction site would absolutely factor into your evaluation of whether that apartment truly beats the baseline. The real danger here isn't that the math is occasionally imperfect. The real danger is the infinite search.
The endless scrolling.
Exactly. Without an algorithmic stopping point, people search forever. They perpetually believe a slightly better apartment or a slightly better job is just one more swipe away. The algorithm forces a commitment.
But it forces a commitment based on an arbitrary mathematical boundary rather than an organic convergence of readiness and opportunity. I mean, you might artificially pass on the perfect apartment because it appeared on day 10 and the algorithm forbade you from committing.
It's discipline.
You are outsourcing your judgment to a formula.
You aren't outsourcing judgment. You are protecting your judgment from its own worst tendencies. Specifically, the illusion that infinite choice equals optimal choice. But let's take this a step further.
Okay.
So the 37% rule might solve the paralysis of picking the apartment. But finding the apartment is a one-time choice. What happens when the choice isn't a one-off event, but a daily grind?
Right.
You cannot run a complex mathematical equation every time you need to decide whether to go to the gym or eat a salad. Making a single optimized choice is useless if you cannot sustain the daily actions required to support it.
Absolutely. And this is where we have to look at sustained behavioral systems, not just isolated choices.
Exactly. We have to look at the underlying neurological mechanism of human behavior, the habit loop. It consists of a cue, a routine, and a reward.
Right. Basic neuroscience.
Neurologically, your brain is incredibly lazy. It wants to save energy, so it takes repeated actions and chunks them into automatic routines managed by the basal ganglia.
Right. If you want to change your life, relying on conscious willpower is a failing strategy because willpower is a highly finite resource. Instead, we must engineer our environments.
Okay, the environmental design approach.
Yes, the framework is simple. If you want to build a good habit, you make it obvious, attractive, easy, and satisfying to trigger that dopamine hit. If you want to break a bad habit, you invert it. Make it invisible, unattractive, difficult, and unsatisfying.
It is pure physical and digital programming.
Exactly. If your goal is to cultivate a reading habit, you place a physical book directly on your pillow when you make your bed in the morning. That makes the cue obvious and the execution easy.
Makes sense. And if you want to stop scrolling social media late at night, you make the habit difficult and invisible by moving your phone charger to the kitchen. You systematically design your environment so that the path of least resistance aligns perfectly with your highest goals.
Okay, I understand the neurological mechanics of the habit loop. But does this actually work in the long run?
I believe it does.
My concern is the extreme fragility of this engineered success. When you meticulously curate your environment so that you only make good choices because the bad choices have been physically removed, you haven't actually changed your internal discipline.
You think so?
Yes, you've just built a highly fragile terrarium.
A fragile terrarium? I like that analogy, but, how do you mean?
Let's say your entire system for avoiding late-night binge watching relies on placing the television remote in another room or using a router blocker.
Sure.
That perfectly designed terrarium only works until you travel for a business trip and find yourself in a hotel room where the remote is sitting right on the nightstand.
Oh.
Or what happens when you face a severe emotional stressor, a family illness, a sudden job loss? When the psychological pressure mounts, a perfectly engineered environment collapses because the internal resilience was never cultivated.
That's a fair concern.
If our success relies entirely on external scaffolding, haven't we just created a system that shatters the moment we step outside our curated bubble?
That is a compelling argument. But I am not convinced by it because it creates a false dichotomy between environmental design and internal resilience.
How so?
The algorithm of making a habit obvious and easy actually builds internal resilience through repetition.
By just going through the motions?
No, it's more than that. When you put the book on your pillow and read every night for 6 months, you aren't just performing a mechanical action. You are undergoing an identity shift. The basal ganglia has taken over. You begin to see yourself as a reader.
Okay, I see where you're going.
The environmental cue is just the starter motor. Once the engine is running, the identity takes over. Yes, the terrarium might break during a business trip, but the ingrained neurological pathway, the identity of being a person who reads before bed, has already been established through hundreds of optimized repetitions.
But human identity is infinitely complex. It isn't just the sum of automated behaviors. If I engineer my environment to trick myself into eating vegetables and working out, I'm essentially treating myself like a pet to be trained.
That's a bit harsh, don't you think?
But it's true. The danger here is that when you strip away the conscious choice, when you make the good habits so easy and automatic that it requires zero thoughts, you also strip away the meaning of the action.
I don't follow.
The friction of making a difficult choice is often what gives that choice its value. Over-optimizing removes the friction, sure, but it fundamentally hollows out the significance of the achievement.
That implies we need friction in mundane tasks to feel meaningful, which I fundamentally reject.
Really?
Yes, the goal of this architecture isn't to remove meaning. It's to automate the mundane so we can reserve our meaning-making for complex, high-level challenges. Why spend your limited cognitive energy fighting the friction of going to the gym when you can automate that choice and spend your energy solving a complex problem at work or being fully present with your kids?
Because life is unpredictable, and perfectly engineered systems, by their very nature, struggle with genuine, complex uncertainty. They are brittle.
Well, let's be real. No matter how well you design your environment, the terrarium is going to crack eventually.
Exactly.
You will encounter unexpected disruptions or bugs. So how do we handle profound uncertainty? The algorithmic approach offers distinct mental models for strategic living when the environment fails.
Okay.
Two of the most powerful are premortems and first principles thinking.
Okay, the strategic foresight models. Explain the mechanics of a premortem in this context.
A premortem flips standard project planning on its head. Instead of optimistically planning a career move and hoping for the best, you imagine that the project has already failed spectacularly.
So you start at the disaster.
Yes. You project yourself a year into the future, look at the smoking crater of your new business or your relationship, and you work backward to uncover the exact vulnerabilities that led to the crash. It actively neutralizes that optimism bias we discussed earlier.
So wait, to live optimally, I have to sit down and vividly imagine my marriage failing or my career imploding?
Yes, exactly. Because by diagnosing the hypothetical failure, you can patch the vulnerabilities today.
Wow.
And combine this with first principles thinking. Most people reason by analogy. They do things because that's how they've always been done. Think of it like a cook in a kitchen who can only follow a printed recipe.
Right.
If they are missing an ingredient, the dish is ruined. First principles thinking is being a chef. You deconstruct a complex problem down to its undeniable fundamental truths, the raw ingredients, and you build a new solution from scratch.
Okay, I follow the chef analogy.
Together, these models allow you to treat your life as a continuous build, measure, learn loop. You hypothesize an action, you measure its impact objectively, and you iteratively learn and pivot.
Look, if you are listening to this right now and thinking, I do not have the energy to run an audit on my entire life, I completely get it.
It's not for everyone right away.
I look at the build, measure, learn loop. I look at the premortems, and I have to ask, what is the hidden cost of this sheer exhaustion? Think about the psychological weight of this.
It's a tool, not a weight.
You are suggesting that to navigate life, we must constantly anticipate spectacular failure just to extract a few data points on risk mitigation. That is a recipe for chronic anxiety.
It's not anxiety, it's calculated confidence. It relieves anxiety because instead of fearing an unknown catastrophe, you have already mapped it out and put a mitigation plan in place.
I come at it from a different way. Mapping out every catastrophe assumes you have the power to control variables that are fundamentally uncontrollable.
Not control, navigate.
And then there is the build, measure, learn loop. Applying this to software development makes total sense. Applying it to human existence is a completely different story. If you treat your life as a continuous cycle of hypothesizing, tracking impact, and pivoting, you turn yourself into a relentless self-auditor.
You say self-auditor like it's a negative trait? What is the alternative? Walking blindly through life, never measuring the impact of your choices, and just repeating the same mistakes?
The alternative is experiencing life without constantly grading it.
But
No, really. If you are forever measuring your personal impact, tracking your mood, optimizing your sleep data, evaluating the ROI of your social interactions, you are perpetually stepping outside of your life to evaluate it.
I disagree.
You become an observer of your existence rather than a participant in it. There's a massive hidden cost here, which is the draining of intrinsic joy.
Joy doesn't require ignorance.
But joy, purpose, and connection often emerge in the unmeasured spaces. They happen in the spontaneous, inefficient, highly unoptimized moments of our lives. If you run a continuous optimization algorithm on your existence, you will inevitably filter out the very human experiences that don't fit neatly into a spreadsheet.
That assumes measurement and participation are mutually exclusive, which they aren't. I would argue that tracking the impact of our choices, measuring whether our actions actually align with our deeply held values, is the highest form of participation.
I'm not sure I agree.
The build, measure, learn loop doesn't drain intrinsic joy. It protects it. It ensures that you aren't wasting years of your life pursuing a path that fundamentally misaligns with your purpose.
Okay, I hear that.
When you use first principles to strip away societal expectations and you build a life based strictly on what is undeniably true for you, you are engaging in profound self-authorship.
Self-authorship, sure, but written in a syntax that is fundamentally unnatural. The danger of first principles thinking applied to human relationships or emotional fulfillment is that humans are not logical machines built on irreducible axioms.
We have logic, though.
We are walking contradictions. We are driven by histories, traumas, and spontaneous desires that cannot be neatly reverse engineered. If you try to deconstruct a personal crisis down to its fundamental truths, you often miss the messy, irrational human element that actually holds the solution.
Well,
The algorithm demands clarity, but life is often successfully navigated through ambiguity.
but ambiguity is exactly what the algorithm helps us navigate. These mental models don't demand a perfectly predictable world. Probabilistic thinking, which is central to this framework, is about embracing uncertainty.
Embracing it by trying to calculate it?
It's about assigning likelihoods to outcomes rather than demanding absolute certainty. It allows us to make peace with the fact that we can make the optimal choice based on the algorithm and still experience a negative outcome, simply because of chance.
Right.
But we understand that we were playing the right odds. That is incredibly freeing. It separates the quality of the decision from the quality of the outcome.
I agree that separating the decision from the outcome is a really valuable cognitive tool. I concede that point. But the overarching philosophy here, that every problem is just a puzzle waiting for the correct algorithm, creates a false sense of mastery over the human condition.
As we step back and look at these strategies as a whole, we need to summarize where we stand. From my perspective, the computational methods we've explored today, whether it's the mathematical clarity of optimal stopping, engineering the habit loop, or navigating uncertainty with first principles, are an absolute must-try toolkit.
Must try? Okay.
We are not talking about turning humans into unfeeling machines. We are talking about utilizing structured thinking to systematically handle the trivial and routine aspects of our days. By building this architecture of automatic success, we don't eliminate our humanity. We actually create more space, more cognitive bandwidth for deep human connection, true creativity, and purposeful living.
And my summary is that these strategies must be approached with extreme caution.
Fair enough.
I certainly do not deny their effectiveness as occasional filters. Using the 37% rule when you are hiring for a role or utilizing a pre-mortem before a major financial investment, these are highly effective strategies for specific high-stakes decisions.
Exactly.
But adopting this as a universal operating system for daily life is perilous. We must be incredibly careful not to optimize away our humanity.
I don't think we are.
The friction of choice, the messy reality of unengineered environments, and the unpredictable nature of our intuition are not bugs to be patched. Spontaneity, inefficiency, and intuitive leaps are features of the human experience. They are where the texture of life actually resides.
This has been a rigorous examination of the ideas from the book, The Algorithm of Life. The foundational text presents a highly compelling case for redefining how we operate, and it genuinely challenges us to deeply examine the mechanisms driving our daily actions.
It certainly forces us to hold up a mirror to our default systems, even if we ultimately choose to reject the algorithmic alternative.
Exactly. And we leave it to you, the listener, to examine your own default systems. You must decide which parts of your life are trapped in inefficiency and could use a strategic algorithmic rewrite, and which parts are sacred precisely because they are left entirely unscripted. We began by talking about the modern paralysis of choice and how it feels like standing in front of an endlessly complex, malfunctioning piece of machinery.
The ultimate question is whether you will try to fix it by writing a better line of code or by simply deciding to walk away from the machine altogether.